day, everyone. My name is KeeWee, and I'm going to give a talk on inflation and the dying dollar. First, some good news. This above chart shows the Spanish flu and how it was controlled after two peaks. The bottom chart is the one that we are facing today, the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you can tell, the peaks are getting lower. So probably the pandemic will be over. But as one problem goes away, another one comes along, and it is inflation. Inflation is on everybody's mind. That's because the US inflation figures for February is 7.9%. This is one of the highest in almost 40 years. Some people think that it's not just 7.9%. It could be more than that. It could be 16% if you use the old measure of measuring US inflation rate. So how do we control inflation? Well, the normal textbook recommendation is you raise interest rates higher than inflation rate. Right now, the interest rate is 0.5%. Okay, so that means the Fed has got a difficult path to take in the next couple of months. And of course, there'll be many twists and turns, and I shall try to forecast for us what might possibly happen. Of course, my views could be totally wrong because it depends on what I have observed. Just like in this picture of Prince William, he was actually telling the press that he just had his third child. But another photographer nearby took a different picture of him giving a rude sign to everyone. So I hope that I don't get the wrong view and convey to you the wrong view. But just in case, please read this. Let's move on. Let's look at the causes of this current inflation. Of course, many say it is due to this COVID, because during these past 2 years, all the central banks have been giving handouts to try to help all of us who are suffering under this pandemic. And the Fed is no different. It has created money, M1, tremendously. Look at this. Just early 2020, the amount of M1 in the US was below 5 trillion. Within 2 years, Jerome Powell has increased the M1 money supply to $21 trillion, which is an addition of $17 trillion. That's a lot of money. Where did all this money go to? Well, 3.7 trillion went through Trump. He was giving handouts to Americans. And Biden gave out another 6 trillion. So altogether, Americans got about 9.7 trillion within 2 years. Now, if you are Chinese, you'll be very pissed off that the Americans have got 9.7 trillion. Why? Because since China entered WTO in early 2001, okay, the Chinese have managed to save about 3 trillion. They took about 20 years to save about 3 trillion. But the Americans managed to create 9.7 trillion in less than 2 years. So you can imagine how pissed off they would be. On top of the COVID, there is the Ukraine crisis, and that's actually boosting inflation even further. The trouble is, the advantage to Russia is that it is very rich in resources, far more than USA or Saudi Arabia, and it sells to everything it has to all over the world. Okay, and because of the war, prices have shot up because everyone feared that there would be shortages. So this is where inflation due to money printing, and this is inflation due to, or rather, the rise in commodity prices due to the war. Here are some of the main Russian exports. Palladium. They almost supply half of all the world's needs for palladium. And palladium is very important. We use it to make cars, laptops, mobile phones. And on top of such things, there's platinum, gold, oil, gas, wheat. Wheat is important because we need to eat. And they are the world's largest wheat exporter. Ukraine is also just close behind. Oil prices shot up. Russia is the world's second largest exporter. And the EU imports like 30% of their oil needs from Russia. Natural gas, again, Russia is the world's largest gas exporter. And again, the EU depends almost 50% of their natural gas needs from Russia, which is about 1 billion euros a day. How did they come to this dependency on Russian gas and oil? Well, actually, for a long time, they were dependent on nuclear power. But in the past few years, maybe the unfortunate or unfortunate thing is that we all listen to a little schoolgirl telling us to go green. So maybe that isn't a good idea now. Let's go back to the last great inflation period, which is the 1970s. That great inflation started in the mid-60s and went up to the early 80s. Again, this was due to excessive spending. Okay, and well, at the time Johnson was the president, he wanted to improve the welfare of Americans. So he had this great welfare program called the Great Society. And of course, he was also at the time trying to fight communism. So he spent a lot of money in the Vietnam War. Then, of course, came the two oil crises that also led to inflation. And of course, subsequent presidents, Nixon, Ford, Carter, they continued spending because at that time they were misled or led to believe that by economists of all people, that when times are bad, you should spend money. And so they continue with this idea of Keynesianism. Just a brief reminder, in those days, from 45 to 71, the world was under this gold standard, okay, whereby if you need to print another $35 US, you must find an ounce of gold. But with all the liberal spending by Johnson, they didn't. They were printing US dollars without finding the equivalent in gold. Well, towards the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of the central banks of Europe wised up and decided to exchange their US dollars for gold. So great was the outflow of gold from US back to Europe and Japan that in August 1971, Nixon came out and stopped this outflow of gold. And we call it the Nixon shock. And thereafter, the whole world went on what we call a fiat money system, whereby every central bank was allowed to print as much money as they liked. So what will give us the exchange rate is basically demand and supply. As far as demand and supply is concerned, the US dollar lost out because everybody felt that they were printing too much money. So the US dollar fell against the Swiss franc right up to 1974. In 1974, it stabilized for a while, but that's because they created this petrodollar system with the Saudi Arabians. So now, before you buy oil, you have to buy US dollars. So that helped to lend support to the US dollars for a while, but not for long. Because subsequently, after 74, people realized that, again, the Americans were not responsible about their money printing. They continued to print, and so the exchange rate of the US dollar continued to fall right to 1978. Now, not only were people selling the US dollar, they were also getting rid of it, okay? Let's look at this share of US dollar global reserves. At its peak was around 1977, when people maybe still believe in the US dollar. Then after that, it went all the way down to just above 45% of all global reserves were in US dollars. I suppose the bottom was 1991, 1990, when they realized that the US was really serious about controlling inflation. But throughout this period, nobody wanted US dollars, so it was just weakening, and it was just being used less as a reserve currency. Carter was the president then. He realized that something must be done. All the previous Fed chairmen didn't want to raise interest rates. So he got someone, Paul Volcker, who believed that the only way to control inflation was to raise interest rates way above inflation rate. And so he did. Inflation was 15% in 1980, and Paul Volcker raised interest rates right up to 20%. And that began to finally take effect and control inflation, because people decide to cut back on their spending. High interest rates, of course, is no good for most people. Borrowers get hit, economy gets hit, workers get hit, and stocks and bonds also got hit. But that is something that we must expect with high interest rates. Today's inflation did not just begin with COVID or with Ukrainian conflict. It went back maybe another 40, 50 years. You see, this is the US interest rates chart. In 1987, there was the Asian currency crisis. Greenspan was in charge. He lowered interest rates. Just after the dot-com bust, he lowered interest rates. And this is 2007 with the Lehman Brothers. That was Ben Bernanke. He was lowering interest rates to revive the economy. So these are the previous chairmen. When Janet Yellen took over, her job was to reverse all the money creation by Greenspan and Ben Bernanke. Powell's job was also to continue that reversal. Okay, now for many years, not many people thought that inflation would be a problem, because despite all the money printing by Ben Bernanke, inflation wasn't a problem. Let me show you this chart. Okay, this is where Lehman Brothers started collapse in the recession, so inflation fell. But with all the money printing, inflation started to pick up. Now, in those early years, the year 2010, 11, 12, people thought that inflation will continue to go up and up. But strangely enough, it peaked at 4%, and since then it's been controlled. But this inflation that we are facing will be different. Why will it be different? I have my own pet theories. Number one, the US dollar was king then. It was the dominant reserve currency. Okay, and when you are the dominant reserve currency, everybody use your currency. And so all the money that you print will be shared among everyone else, every country in the world. It's just like when you open a tap of water, you are unlikely to flood the field because the field is too big. In fact, as I mentioned before, 60 to 70% of all US dollars created are outside USA. This cannot be said of the Germans in 1922 when they had their hyperinflation, or Zimbabwe in 2007, because those two countries, their currencies were not used outside their country. So of course, with if you print too much, then you get inflation faster. But fortunately for the US dollar, it was not the case. So for years and years, you could print a lot of US dollars and it didn't hit back in high inflation for the US economy. But things have changed since. There's this de-dollarization, which means people are using less dollars. It started in the year 2000 with the birth of euro. And then, of course, the weaponization of the US dollar made people averse to keeping US dollars or using US dollars. Let's look at the chart again. In 1991, the US reserves was at its bottom, maybe just above 45%. Since then, with inflation control, people felt more confident. They started to accumulate more US dollar as reserves. In 1999, euro arrived, And people thought, well, good, let's diversify and hold less US dollar. That's when the US dollar share fell. But then something happened along the way. In 2009, there was a Greek crisis. And people realized that maybe the euro is not so stable. And so they continued to increase their holdings of US dollars until it peaked in 2014. That's when Russia invaded, or some people say liberated Crimea, okay, and they were sanctioned. Russia learned a bitter lesson then that maybe it's not so safe to use US dollar that much. And since 2014, Russia has been trying to de-dollarize their economy. It's not just Russia. I think there are other countries, Iran and China, has since the mid 6-7 years ago realized that it is safer to use less US dollars. So what has happened with de-dollarization? It means that the open field is maybe a bit smaller, and so your running tap might soon flood your garden. This de-dollarization was given a boost during the Russian conflict with Ukraine. Sanctions are actually like financial wars. I mean, it's out to kill each other. Some people think that it's rather merciless. For instance, they were selling this Sberbank. This is the Russia's most prominent bank, from $21 US dollars. They sold it all the way down to 5 cents. Can you imagine the pain inflicted by Russian shareholders? On top of that, they sort of banned many Russian banks from using SWIFT. SWIFT is used to transfer money all over the world. US use about 40% euro, so this US dollar and euro actually use the SWIFT system the most. Well, now they're moving on to the Chinese system, and of course the Russians have their own system, which is the SPFS system. On top of that, credit cards were withdrawn. So what the Russians did was, well, they switched to the Chinese credit card. E-payment system also withdrawn. Well, the Russians are moving to the Chinese one, Alipay. All these actions are actually de-dollarizing because people, or Russians especially, trust less on SWIFT, the credit cards, everything else. But two other things that is actually earth-shattering. Number one, the Swiss banking, they have always been independent. Even during the 2 world wars, British customers could go to Switzerland to get their money, and German customers could go to Switzerland and get their money. But Switzerland turned around and sanctioned Russian assets as well. So this is earth-shaking because it has never happened before in the long history of Switzerland as a private banking center. Also, all over the world, they've been confiscating Russian property. Again, this is shocking to everyone, because imagine if you are a rich person in Middle East or in Asia, you'll be thinking twice. What if my country has a conflict with the US or the Western countries? Will they also confiscate my money in my Swiss banks, or will they confiscate my property all over the world? And that has given a lot of people food for thought. In 1971, I mentioned before, there was this Nixon shock. Well, what happened in February this year? I call it the Biden shock, because what happened has surprised a lot of people. Even the Russians were surprised when their foreign reserves, which are usually kept in Western central banks, were also seized. This has never happened before. I mean, if you go back to the Crimean War in the 19th century, UK, France, Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia, they were both fighting against Russia. But throughout the war, both sides continued to pay each other debts they owed or interest they owed. So this one is earth-shaking. This is what has happened in the past month. Many people think that these sanctions have really scored an own goal because a lot of unintended consequences have appeared. Okay? For instance, Saudi Arabia is thinking twice about selling their oil in US dollars to the Chinese. They are supposed to make up their minds soon. Well, Russia is not sitting alone and doing nothing. They have struck back. They have also seized some Western assets in return. They have banned a lot of Russian exports, hopefully to inflict pain on their adversaries. Okay, look at this Russian ruble. Russian ruble before the war was trading around 70, 80. Okay, when this announcement of sanctions happened, 900 billion rubles, that is almost all the rubles outside Russia, were used to weaken the ruble. So it weakened from maybe 75 right to 140. Okay, well, what's the point of weakening the Russian ruble? Because when your ruble is weak, all your imports will be very expensive. Okay, and I suppose the plan was to cripple the Russian economy as well. Well, what the Russian central bank do? Well, they raise interest rates to 20%. This is normal when a currency is under attack. Most central banks would do that. But Russia did something a bit more than that. Those countries that sanction Russia are considered unfriendly countries. And Russia announced a few weeks ago that they have to buy Russian gas using rubles from April 1st. Okay? Now, that means if you are Germany, France, and you want to continue buying gas from Russia, you have to pay rubles. Now, most of the rubles have been taken off the market, so you have to borrow. At 20% borrowing rubles, that's not a smart move. Okay, so Russia has come up with a window of opportunity for them. Russia fixed gold at 1 ounce at about current levels, about $2,000, and we will buy your gold, okay, in exchange for rubles. So basically say, if you want gas, you need rubles. Since it's not viable to borrow rubles at 20%, all right, you sell us your gold and we'll give you rubles. So if this goes on, and that means a lot of gold will be flowing from Europe to Russia in the next few months. This what Russia has just announced is actually really earth-shaking. It is, first of all, not only de-dollarizing, but it will also, this model of payment will probably be copied by other countries as well. You know, a lot of people might say, oh no, this is nothing. Just like a ship has struck iceberg. The water is coming in, but the ship is still afloat. But give enough time, the ship will sink. Because what if next week, the Middle Eastern oil producers come and say, well, we don't want US dollars for oil. Why don't you sell your gold to us? We give you Middle Eastern currency and you can buy our oil. This will really upset the global financial system. So the world has, some people call it, this is a new world order or whatever, okay? As far as Russia is concerned, for a long time, they have always looked at US and Europe as their center of gravity, center of culture. Africa is just a provider of raw materials. Middle East is also a provider of raw materials. Russia actually for a long time wanted to integrate itself with Europe, okay? In fact, it's a long history of it. Peter the Great in the 17th century was the first Russian king, emperor or Tsar to refocus Russian culture activity towards the Western Europe. Okay, and actually, Russia for a long time has been looking up at Western Europe as their model of what they want to be. Okay, and actually it hasn't really changed that much. In the 1990s, Russia wanted to join NATO and also wanted to join EU many times. All the times they were rejected. Just 20 years ago, Putin was saying, Russia is a very diverse country, but we are part of Western European culture. He himself wants to be integrated into Western Europe. But after this conflict, he's definitely not going to look west anymore. The world after February 2022 will be still, the Americans and the Europeans will be together, but as far as Russia is concerned, it will look east to China. It will look to India. And the Middle Eastern countries will maybe look at Asia to source their goods and services. Africa too. So the world is going to change, or has changed since February 2022. Now the question is, this de-dollarization vehicle that's running ahead, how do you stop it? How do you keep the demand for US dollars strong? Well, Powell has to do, all he has to do is to do what Paul Volcker did in 1979, raise interest rates high enough so that the US dollar will be attractive. But he's not going to do that because big business will stop him. Why? Because if you look at the charts I've shown you before, from its peak, every step along the way, the peaks have become lower. Why? Because we have borrowed too much money. If rates go up to 7.9% to control today's US inflation, this global house of cards will collapse. How big is the global house of cards? Well, according to 2020 estimates, this is in trillions, 12 zeros. All the central banks of the world have created $6.6 trillion. And of course, you understand the multiply effect. Stocks have multiplied to 90 trillion, real estate 300 trillion, and derivatives maybe 900 to 2,000 trillion. But in the past 2 years, Jerome Powell has created another $17 trillion. So can you imagine the multiples of stocks and real estate valuations? This will give us food for thought. Now, before I continue, let's talk a bit about Ben Bernanke's quantitative easing and what it means. During the Lehman Brothers crisis, he was doing two things. He was buying bonds from the public. And it means you buy bonds, you give people cash. Great, that's to help businesses. Secondly, he was lowering interest rates. When you lower interest rates, you make it cheaper for business to borrow money from you. Okay, that's QE starting, but they must come to an end. And towards the end, you are supposed to stop buying bonds. Okay, and that's one step. The second step is you must slowly raise interest rates. And the third step is, all the bonds that you bought earlier, you should start selling them. So 2 steps forward, 3 steps backward. Let's look at what happened to the Ben Bernanke's QE. In 2014, okay, look at this chart. This is all the accumulated bonds which the Fed has bought from 2008, okay, from 1 trillion to almost 4.5 trillion. Janet Yellen was in charge, and she stopped buying bonds. 1 year later, she raised interest rates. Almost 2 years later, okay, Jerome Powell took over, and he started to sell bonds. Now, his job was supposed to sell bonds all the way back down to before 2008, but he didn't. He continued to accumulate more bonds in early 2020. Why? Well, the problem was that Powell couldn't complete Ben Bernanke's QE, or reverse rather. What happened was in September 2019, he had to cut interest rates again. Remember, COVID started in early 2020. So why did he cut interest rates even before COVID started? Well, that's because there was a crack in the repo market. The repo market is a big overnight market where every day, every night, all the financial institutions would balance their books. If they have too much cash, they will lend it in the market. If they have too little cash, they'll borrow from the market. It's like a pawn shop to us. We have not enough money. We will pawn our gold, and hopefully when in a few days' time we will have enough cash, we will return to the pawn shop and take our gold back. So the repo market is a bit like this. In September last year, in 2019, the repo market rate shot up to 10% or higher. This is dangerous because the repo rate should never be above the Fed funds rate, and around that time was about 2.5. What this means is that many companies were already in trouble. At Fed fund rates of 2.5%, they couldn't bear it. They had to borrow market overnight. So that's why Powell couldn't complete and reverse Ben Bernanke's QE. Now he's got his own QE. Well, he was buying bonds, but 2 weeks ago, he stopped buying $120 billion of bonds a month, and he started raise interest rates from 0.25 to 0.5, okay? His aim is 3. But the third thing he has to do is that the Fed has accumulated $9 trillion worth of bonds, and he's supposed to sell that as well. It's going to be a tough job for him. What if Powell doesn't raise interest rates high enough to control inflation? Well, then it'll be back like 1970s. People will dump the US dollar. Because when a country has high inflation and you are not doing anything about the raising interest rates, the currency would weaken. And this fear will come back. So Powell, unfortunately, is caught between the devil and deep blue sea. If he raises interest rates too high, it kills the economy, kills the dollar. If he raises rates even to 3%, it's still too high for businesses. And it's still going to be bad for the dollar and the US economy. People might say, KeeWee, this view is a bit over pessimistic because you see the US dollar has been up and down throughout the past 50 years. Well, that's true. That's true because there wasn't an alternative. And before de-dollarization gathered steam and the rise of the ruble just this week. On top of de-dollarization, there's another competitor coming, and this is the digital yuan. The way to kill the dollar is actually for the renminbi to be floated. But China is not going to float the renminbi yet. That's because it needs a stable exchange rate to support its exporters. So it's been controlling the renminbi dollar exchange rate for a long time. China plans to internationalize its currency. That means it will want to float the yuan sooner or later. But it must fulfill 3 things. First of all, it must open its capital account, and let the money flow in and out easily. Of course, dirty money, or there's always this fear that the rich Chinese will take their money and flee China. But maybe with all these sanctions in the Western banking system, maybe Chinese will not be so eager to take their money out of China anymore. Just like for a long time, Chinese tourists were restricted from going overseas for holidays. But now, every year about 130 million Chinese goes overseas for holidays. And every year, 130 million come back home. So that might also happen to its cash flows. Number 2, China must rely less on exports and boost domestic demand. And of course, since China joined WTO, the export to GDP ratio has gone up and it's coming back down again, which is good, but maybe China is waiting till it hits 15% before it floats the renminbi. Secondly, Chinese are not spending enough at home. Their household consumption to GDP ratio is 38%, which is very low. The equivalent for developed countries like USA is 68%. So there's a long way for China to go. Because you see, if you depend less on exports and you spend most of your money at home in China, then all these sanctions will have less impact on you. And that's the idea. China's dual circulation, okay, that is hopefully to direct activity towards the domestic market. Common prosperity, if you bring down inequality, usually it leads to higher domestic spending. So that's also another policy which they are pushing. And of course, you look at China's 5-year plan, latest 5-year plan, it's a lot of focus on the domestic consumption. Third thing, China must have more trade and hopefully more people use the renminbi. Right now, of course, it's very little used by others. So when China started Belt Road Initiative in 2013, the aim was also to coincide with their aim to internationalize the renminbi. 145 countries have joined, which is about 75% of the world, all the countries of the world. So they're on the right track, but it's just that when is the right time to free the renminbi. When the day comes, the US dollar will be severely compromised. Some people say, no, it took almost 33 years before the US dollar replaced the sterling pound. But I don't think it will take 30 years for that to happen for the renminbi. That's because the digital yuan is very simple to use. Or anyone who has a smartphone would be able to use it. How popular can it be? Well, just like TikTok. TikTok was the highest loading app last year in the world. And you look at this chart, it hit 1 billion at the fastest possible time compared to WeChat, WhatsApp, Facebook. So likewise, digital yuan would be used very, very easily. It's so easy to use. Okay, the US probably knows this is happening. Logic says that they should do something about their economy. They must compete with China to stop China from overtaking the US economy. One example, 2 months ago, there was this bridge in Pittsburgh. It collapsed overnight. Buses were damaged, cars were damaged, people were hurt, but good thing no one died. And this was one day before Biden visited Pittsburgh. He was there to view the carnage, okay? Like I said, good thing no one died. Which goes to show that the US economy requires a lot of spending to improve its infrastructure. But then why is the US still spending $800 billion on its military? $800 billion is more than the next 11 countries combined together. Why? Well, this is my view. The US military has only one job, and that job is to preserve the US dollar as a reserve currency. Because as long as the US dollar is a reserve currency, then better still the only reserve currency, then that's how the US empire controls the world. Some people say, oh, the US don't know what they're doing. Actually, not true. I don't agree. I think the US knows what they're doing. And since 1991, when the USSR collapsed, the long-term plan is to remain as number one. That's part of the Wolfowitz doctrine, whereby any upcoming competitor must be squashed. Who are the main competitors of USA today? Well, there's EU, Russia because it's military power, and of course China. But this recent Russian-Ukraine conflict has fixed basically EU and Russia, because now they look like they're going to be in conflict for maybe at least the rest of this year, or maybe for a few years to come. So as far as EU and Russia is concerned, they probably have been fixed. So the focus now is on China. China is a very difficult entity to control. It keeps on growing. You know? In 2014, China overtook US GDP in terms of purchasing power parity. In terms of nominal GDP, the forecast is maybe by 2030 or even 2027, depending on who you read. Panicking, they came out with a report, or they got the Rand Corporation to come out with a report, how to stop China's rise. Well, they came up with some recommendations. One of them is that you must initiate a war with China to reduce China's GDP by 1/3. Reports suggest a conventional war. You see, China for a long time depends on South China Sea for its exports and imports, shipping and all that. Okay? And if you have disturbance in South China Sea, all shipping will be stopped. And that will really hurt China. So this is what the Rand Corporation is saying. Create some disturbance in the South China Sea, and that would help to bring down the Chinese economy. So now you can understand why in 2018, Trump was following through the plan to try to stop Chinese economy from growing too fast. In November 2020, NATO realigned the new mission, and the new mission is actually to contain China. Last month, 2 months ago rather, there was another report which is similar to the Rand Corporation report, except that it was couched in more diplomatic terms. This time it includes India. Can all this lead to a hot war? Before I continue, actually a hot war can be profitable. In the case of Iraq and Libya, a lot of people made money in terms of confiscated gold and oil revenues. If China loses a hot war like this, China's gold will be seized too. The Chinese economy will be wrecked, and China will become a factory for the world. Why am I talking about a war? Well, economists is also concerned about war because whoever wins the war, his currency will dominate, and that's important. And that will affect our asset prices too. Imagine in 1944, you are under the occupation of the Japanese forces, and they issue all these Japanese occupation forces currency. 1 year later, all this became worthless because Japan lost the war. For a long time, I thought that a hot war would not be possible, practical reasons. That's because you look at the charts. The US and China, they import and export from each other so much. I mean, both love money, so why would they want to fight? Let's ask an ex-diplomat, because he's got something revealing to say. This is KeeWee TAN. He was once the Chinese ambassador to US. And last December, he gave a speech. One of the things he said was that the US will try every possible means to suppress, contain, divide, and besiege China. That made me think, was he saying that the US would want a war? Let's check with a political scientist and neocon. Graham Allison has written a book in 2017 whereby he said that looking at history, there's a very, very likelihood that the rising power and the incumbent power would fight. And he said that Taiwan will be the hot issue. According to this neocon Elbridge Colby, who wrote a book in just a few months ago, he concluded that a war over Taiwan is desirable because there's no other way of stopping China's rise. And he said that if there's a war, USA has a winning chance. And he said that if China must be provoked to appear as the aggressor, doesn't it ring bells? Right now, today, we frame Russia as the aggressor. But those of you who read a bit more might think that maybe this war, this conflict, began in 2014. But history will prove us right or wrong down the road. Just like history can tell us that Hollywood frames Japan as an aggressor. But if you read further, you find that from 1938, there was a series of trade sanctions imposed on Japan. On top of that, Panama Canal was closed, and in July 41, Japanese assets were seized by the American government. And 1 month later, oil was embargoed to Japan. So without oil, the Japanese imperial force could not do anything. And at that time, they were fighting a war with China. So they need, Japan was basically painted in a corner. So they had to attack and occupy the rich oil fields in Indonesia at that time. Finally, we have heard from political scientists, we heard from a strategist, we heard from an ex-diplomat. Let's look at this from a game theory point of view. Game theory says this very simply. We have a choice of peace or war. Of course, if both of us choose war, red will be China, blue will be USA. Now, of course, we both will be worse off, -5, -5. If both of us choose peace, we'll be here, then both of us will be better off. So, of course, a better position is to both aim for peace. But what if one party goes for peace and the other promises peace but goes for war? Then they'll gain more, plus 10 points. It's the same. If US goes for peace and China says we go for peace but they go for war, then China will gain more. So basically this is the prisoner's dilemma. So of course the best position to be in is to choose peace. Both stick to it and both will profit. But underlying this agreement that both must keep their word, like gentlemen, before we can have peace. If you ask Putin, Putin will say the US did not keep their word. Because in 1990, James Baker told Gorbachev that NATO will not move 1 inch east. But we know that since 1990, there are 14 countries have joined NATO. Ask the Chinese. In 1972, when Nixon visited Mao Zedong, they agreed on one China policy, which is still holding. US is supposed to remove its military installations in Taiwan, but they still have military advisors training Taiwanese soldiers. And in one of the further agreements, Jimmy Carter told Deng Xiaoping that the US would not sell or reduce arms shipment to Taiwan. That has not happened. The US has increased in quality and quantity arms shipments to Taiwan. On that basis, as far as the Russians and the Chinese are concerned, we are supposed to promise and keep to our word. One of us didn't. And so we will now prepare for war. And from a prisoner's dilemma point of view, war is the best solution for each individual to undertake. Perhaps what we heard is the Russians and the Chinese telling us that the Americans did not keep their word. We don't know. Maybe the Americans have also stories to tell us that the Russians and the Chinese did not keep their words. So now it becomes like a lover's quarrel. There's her version of events, there's his version of events, and there's the truth. We outsiders will never know. Very often, talks cannot settle disputes. And what happens? Then the rule of force enters. The question is, if there's going to be a hot war, when will it be? Let's look at the capabilities of both countries, USA and China. And I rely again on a US report, came out 1 year ago. This is Guam, and in this report said that in 1999, Chinese military coverage was right up to this coast only. But in 2021, because of all the new missiles that China has, it could hit forces, American forces in Guam. That's where a US base is. And if we wait another 4 years, the Chinese will have military capabilities and coverage right out to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So according to this report, the best time to win a hot war, it must strike before 2025, because beyond that, China will overwhelm the US military forces. But let's take a pinch of salt, because all these reports, maybe they want to paint such a scenario so they get more money for the Pentagon. So I'll give it another 5 years. So I'll say maybe there's a likelihood of a war before 2030. Of course, if the war turns out to be a nuclear war, it would be disastrous. I won't be giving such talks anymore. But the good news is that today's armies rely on satellites for directing the bombs and missiles and the planes to your enemies. Now, one thing interesting, Russia last November announced that it has perfected its Star Warrior system, which is a way of shooting down all the 32 GPS missiles up in the space. This is what Russia claims. If it's true, and of course armies will always claim more than they are capable of, if it's true, that means Russia can take down all the satellites in one go, and the US might be sort of naked for a long time. But we never know. China is also supposed to have come up with their own laser anti-satellite system. It's supposed to be ready this year, but again, all of them could be bullshitting to us. And how do we know? Maybe the US also has their own system. But on paper, apparently this Russian system is the only one available right now. Okay, let's recap. Inflation is bad for US dollar and the US economy. Raising interest rates to 8% or higher is not possible, or even keeping it at 3% or 2.5% is going to be equally bad. De-dollarization is bad for the US dollar and US economy, and there are many competitors for the US dollar as a reserve currency coming up. Ruble is one, renminbi will be the next one. And to prolong US dollar dominance, or the US empire, the US military must act soon. How soon? Well, for them to win, a hot war must take place sometime before 2030, the next 8 years. Again, this is my view. I could be wrong, just as different photographers saw Prince William differently. I could be seeing this, what I've just told you. I could be totally wrong. So I'm open to that. A word of thanks to all those who have given me permission to use all that nice pictures and all that. Thank you. This is for charity. And I thank you all for attending. One more slide to show you. And this is the QR code for you to donate any money, spare money you have, to the YWCA. Their members and their clients need all the help they can get. Thank you very much.